This one is a 2-for-1 deal, advice that's useful for both GM and player alike. Failure isn't all bad. What's more important is how a given individual deals with failure. After all, conventional wisdom says that failure is an opportunity to learn. In fact, in the novel Dracula, Dr. Abram van Helsing says, "Nothing is too small, I counsel you. Put down in record even your doubts and surmises. Hereafter it may be of interest to you to see how true you guess. We learn from failure, not from success." So, with all that said, let me paint some specific scenarios in TRPGs where a failure of some sort can be learned from. The most obvious sort of a failure in a TRPG is when a roll doesn't succeed and there are consequences. If it's the kind of a situation that keeps happening from a mechanical standpoint, it could teach a lesson in avoiding getting into that scenario, or using a different approach at least. For example, in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, skeletons of all types have a weakness to bludgeoning damage, causing them to take double damage when they're hit with a hammer or something. So let's say a certain scenario calls for clearing out a bunch of skeletons quickly, and the party just barely makes it in time. If they didn't exploit this weakness that skeletons had in the scenario, the lesson to be learned here could be that they might have succeeded by a better margin if they had a few warhammers or clubs handy. Though combat scenarios are just one part of TRPGs. Outside of combat, failing a roll may not have as serious of consequences, but could still change what a given character is able to accomplish in a given scene. As an aside, it's a good rule of thumb to roll first, then describe what happens, because nothing is more of a drag than describing what you have your character do, and then the roll simply doesn't support what you had in mind. Either way, whether you do that or not, such a failure could still be an opportunity to learn more about the improv aspect of role-playing games. You won't always get your way, so you have to adapt to what does go on. As an example, in a game of Ryutama I was in, my character was a merchant, which gave him the ability to buy things at a lower price so long as he bought at least 4 or more of them. The GM wanted to roleplay the actual buying of things from time to time, so we had a scene in a busy jewelry shop when I tried to use this. My character was patient, despite being constantly interrupted by other buyers. After a few story beats of this, my character was able to state his intent to buy a bunch of rings and necklaces, and punctuated his request by asking for stuff that wasn't moving very well in the store. And so, when we rolled to determine what would happen, in that scenario, since I rolled high, the GM ruled that my patience and willingness to clear out unnecessary stock was rewarded, with a lower price. Though if my roll failed, one possible outcome could have been that the jeweler was so busy with all the customers that they were having, they didn't want to deal with haggling with anybody, even if it meant getting rid of stuff they couldn't move. Let's shift gears into talking about the GM's take on this, how to deal with players who fail to meet certain objectives. The solution here is very similar to a player handling a die roll going wrong, or the GM handling a player otherwise doing something unexpected that derails the game. You improvise. For example, let's say that as the GM you had a story planned out where the player characters go on a journey to confront a great evil, and you wind up at the climax of the heroes facing off against this nemesis in an epic showdown. But, because of a few bad and improbably repeated rolls, the villain gets the upper hand, and it looks like the heroes are going to fail and be vanquished. One way to handle this would be to bend the rules so that the villain is actually easier or less threatening, thus preserving the story you wanted to tell of good triumphing over evil. Another way could be to introduce somebody or something that tips the odds back into the favor of the players. Both situations being literal deus ex machina, where some previously unseen entity resolves the conflict. Or you could simply allow the villain to win, and the heroes to fail. The heroes may be done for, but unless they were trying to stop something completely cataclysmic, in which case I ask why you were creating a villain that had such a final and psychopathic endgame, the story can still go on, just probably not from the hero's perspective, or maybe not in the same setting. Come to think, there are 2 good examples of this actually happening in video games. The first being Final Fantasy VI, where halfway through the game, a psychotic general dressed up as a clown betrays his emperor, seizes the ultimate power secured by said emperor, and uses it to obliterate the world and ascend to godhood. All the while, the heroes are unable to prevent any of this. The game continues on then, after the world is destroyed, with the heroes regrouping to make a second attempt on taking out this deranged little harlequin. The second example I'm thinking of is a more contemporary title, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. In fact, the very premise of this game is that the world is ruined because the hero was unable to stop a great and powerful evil. As a result, Monsters are everywhere, and they never permanently go away. Travel is dangerous, and people are forced to live in the outskirts of the continent, away from the festering evil in the central region. And you play as that very hero that failed, complete with some longer-lived races harboring a grudge against you for your past shortcomings. In short, accepting bad roles, even if they lead to the failure of your character or the protagonists of the story, can lead to interesting new opportunities, specifically for telling tales of redemption. And even if the heroes don't get the chance to redeem themselves, you can always say that their story was meant to be a tragedy.